Welcome to Cycling Explained, hosted by Brent from Pro Cycling Bets. Cycling Explained attempts to demystify the world of professional cycling and delves into the variables surrounding the nuanced layers of the sport itself. In each episode, we'll explore one variable and how it affects the riders, the teams, the tactics, and the betting markets. Want to begin to watch cycling but don't know where to start? Interested in betting on races but have no idea how to find good value picks? You've come to the right place. In this intro episode, we'll generically dive into the world of pro cycling, whereas in future episodes we'll specifically focus on one variable and how it influences the riders, the teams, the tactics, and how you can use it to better find value in your betting picks. Alright, so we got Nick here. He's going to join us for episode 1 of Cycling Explained. Pleasure. I'm glad you can make it.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks. So Nick was asking me some questions about the Giro this morning, so I thought I'd get him on and help out and try and, broach the subject of cycling with like a younger fan base. This is kind of what I'm trying to do, and like get people interested into it. I feel like there's a lot of benefit from like the long form media aspect of cycling compared to some of what we have these days. So so I guess start off with maybe what you asked me this morning.
Yeah, so I overheard two British announcers talking loudly about cycling, and I know that Giro's going on, so I'd love to learn more about it and what's going on. Yeah,
for sure. So the Giro is one of like the 3 major tours, right? And take this with a grain of salt. Like, I'm new coming into this as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm on the trainer like multiple hours a day, and all I do is watch cycling. So like I've ramped up quick, but the Giro is what the pundits love to say is like the small brother of the tours. So there's 3 major tours. There's the Vuelta, La Vuelta, the Tour de France, which everyone knows, and then there's the Giro d'Italia. And the Giro comes first in the season.
Cool.
The Vuelta is run in Spain. It used in April, but now it comes in August, which is probably a horrible month given how hot it is in Spain. It's quite a calamity these days. But Tour de France is obviously, and the Giro wants to be that. The Giro wants to be that, like, older brother kind of aspect, but it's not quite there yet. And so what we're experiencing it's a 3-week tour. So the Grand Tour is all 3 weeks. Most tours are, in early spring or summer in the fall are week long, and then you have a bunch of classics in the spring.
Cool. Yeah.
So I have a good kind of Excalibur up that I can share with you. Maybe you might put in the video of just like the cycling season explained in an infographic way. But it's quite fun. But this year in the Giro, you asked me how it's doing. It is a shit show. Absolutely, it is. The weather's horrible. It's been like super cold, super rainy. Imola in F1 this year is completely washed out, which is also in Italy.
Yeah, I heard about that.
And so, and people are dropping like flies, right? So there's a core, like, I'm gonna not dig into the weeds here in cycling. We can maybe dig in if you're interested.
Sounds good.
But there's a core number of general classification contenders, which are like, general classification is like at the end of the 3 weeks, whoever has the fastest over the course of those like days, they all get added up and wins the race, right? And so there's a lot of people who will immediately get kicked out of the GC race just because they fall off, they crash, they're not really there to do it. To be a GC contender, it comes down to a few elements, but the main GC contenders are good at 2 things. They're good at climbing mountains and time trialing, because sometimes every day is a different type of course, which is really unique to cycling. And in this Giro, there's actually 3 time trials, so it's pretty heavy on the time trial basis.
And what's a time trial?
Yeah, so time trial, it's super nuanced. They used to have a prologue, which was anything between like 6 to 8K at the start. It's just like a super quick race to get off the bat and get people like listed.
Yeah, cool.
And so it's like, how fast can you do that 8-kilometer race? Yeah. But now they're starting to move away from prologues, and they're moving to time trials, which are usually in the range of 15 to 25K. You'll get ones also that are 40K and longer. You've had one like that. And so you're basically just trying to do that course in as quick as possible. What comes into this, the time trial is interesting because, certain time trials are heavier, like they have a hill in them. And so if you have a time trial who's heavier, he might be very good on a flat time trial, but less good when there's a hill involved because it's harder to push yourself up the hill. There might be a lot of turns involved. So it's coming down to bike handling, all that jazz. And then also like the weather can be bad. So the time trial lasts 3 hours, right? Depending on when you start. They go off every minute or so. So if you go off when it's raining, you'll have a worse time than when you go off. So this is kind of what I love about cycling, is that there's so many variables. There's like so many variables that you can dig into that affect each of the stages. And it's so nuanced, and it's actually why I'll be promoting. I'm going to write a book basically on it, because it's just so interesting to me, and it's something I've like had a passion to doing. So the time trials and the climbing, getting back to the general classification. And so at the end of the first 5 days, you have we're talking maybe 20 to 30 people are still in the general classification out of a total rider base of 180. Okay. So the total rider base is 180, but it narrows down to around 20 or 30 who are still within, 5 to 10 minutes of each other. And so these 5 to 10 minute people have been dropping like flies. And they've been dropping like flies because they've either been crashing because of the weather, or they're getting COVID. So COVID has really impacted the race this year, with a number of them having to drop out. Just 2 days ago, someone crashed and broke their femur bone. And so it's like really been a tough race for the Giro and the number one contender. So there's 6 well-known riders who generally win most of the races. They're called the Big Six. And so there's an article up on the website if you guys are interested. And the Big Six riders, Roglic and Evenepoel, 2 of the Big Six, were facing off against each other in this race. And Remco was, he's like a 22-year-old kind of, I might not be 22, but I might be bullshitting that. But he's young, and cycling is kind of like progressing to be a younger and younger sport. And we can dig into that as well. But honestly, we can be here for ages. So we'll keep this one short. And Remco just had to drop out. So now it's kind of like you lost one of your star contenders in this race. And the Giro is like, just like everyone's dropping, and it's becoming sort of farcical at this point, because so many people. And also so the Belgian media the Belgians are crazy, right? Like, I think I've told you the stat where 10% of the population watches the cyclocross races, which is crazy. And Remco's Belgian, and so they were all super involved in the Giro. And now that he's dropped out, there's less interest there, and the Giro is getting stressed. But also, just the Giro is just like poorly organized. It's been like they haven't done accommodations for riders well at the end of the stages that like they don't have backup plans. So if there's snow on the top of a mountain, they can't do it. They don't have any backup plan. And then like there's this one time trial at the end, which was supposed to have this insane climb, like super steep climb. And they usually allow a bike change during a time trial if it goes from like being flat stage to a mountain stage, because you want a different type of bike. So you'll take like that 5 to 10 second hit to be able to switch to an aerodynamic, like a lighter bike, to be able to go up that mountain. But it's so steep that they didn't plan this, so they couldn't get cars up. And so the people are going to have to go up on motorcycles and like hand them their bike. But then they didn't have enough motorcycles, and it was just like poorly planned. And so that's kind of what the Giro is. It's run by RCS, which is the Italian cycling. It runs most of the Italian races, and like some Saudi, not the Saudi two, but I think 2 of Oman. And it's just like not super great compared to the ASO. And the ASO is the Amari Sports Organization, which runs the Tour de France. It runs La Vuelta. It's honestly where I get all my photos. It's great. It's like super well run and does a good job. Not perfect, obviously. No one does a perfect job. So
I don't know. So these organizations are both like choosing the routes, like doing all the like administration, but also like booking accommodation and kind of like setting up the teams for success in terms of like equipment and bikes and stuff.
It's sort of it. Some of it falls on the team, some of it falls on the organization. So the organization has to make sure that there's enough hotels that the teams can book to, right? And so, for example, on one of these stages, the RCS provided the option to fly down via a helicopter. You had to pay in ahead of time, and some teams didn't, and they got stuck with taking a gondola down with like fans. And so you have these like professional cyclists like going down with these fans, and then some of some of the pundits have said like, oh, that's how they got COVID, kind of stuck in this
Interesting.
gondola
Yeah, of course.
with these fans. And so it's been, a bit of so, it's unfortunate. It just makes the race a little bit less interesting, a little bit less involved. But it's also good for some of those smaller riders who kind of have a better chance now. Generally, I think what's going on right now is that teams are just super cautious. They kind of want to, it's like now a war of attrition.
Who can make it?
Who can make it, right? And so there's this thing in cycling where it's common to win a stage. I would say if I really have to be like super, super high level, you can win a stage via a sprint. And so the sprinters will win in a bunch sprint at the end. So there's like certain riders who are known to sprint well, right? Just like in track or running. And then there's also almost all stages have a breakaway. So a breakaway is like a group of riders who will go away at the start of stage. So stage is like, 180 kilometers to 220 kilometers, kind of usually. And they'll just go off the front by themselves. And they'll kind of, that's another way to win the stage. And we can dig into why a breakaway happens. But then there's also usually sometimes a GC, where it's like a GC battle. And GC means general classification. And so that's when those players kind of come out to try and make time gaps on their opponents. And that usually happens either on time trial stages or mountain stages. Because, it's hard to, sprints are risky. You only make up a few seconds, but on like a mountain stage, you can make up 2 to 3 minutes on your opponent compared to in a sprint, a little bit here and there. There's also bonuses that come into play. So throughout the stage, you'll have like intermediate sprints where you might be able to pick up a few bonus seconds here and there that factor in to your overall time. I'll take it down. And so Roglic, who's one of the main contenders, or one of the big six, that's what he's well known for, is kind of taking those bonus seconds, slowly piling them up.
That's cool. Quick language terminology question. So the tour is 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And there's different stages. Is it one stage per day, or like how do the stages fit in?
Yeah. So it's one stage per day, and each stage is kind of completely different. It usually goes, sometimes it goes from the same town to the same town, like but usually it's point to point.
Okay,
And so you'll get to experience, and that's like one of the, I feel that there's so many things that people can like about cycling, just because there's so many nuances to it. So I might not like, some people really like the tech and getting involved there. I don't care as much about the tech, but some people do. But the nice thing about cycling is also, I feel, the imagery, the history, like the castles that are showing and all that. Landscapes. And it really intrigues me in that angle of it. So the point to point where you get to see all these cool architecture to watch.
Typically the same route every year across each country?
It's completely new every year.
Oh, wow.
So you'll have some of the same climbs every year because there's only so many mountains. But certain climbs will be reused every, I would say, 2 to 3 years. But new routes will usually happen every year.
That's nice.
And then in the classics, it's a little bit different. The classics is like the spring season, and those happen mainly in France and in Belgium. There's also week-long tours in Spain and whatnot, but specifically in the classics, they'll have the same route roughly every year. And there's 5 monuments, which are classics that have so much history. They've been around for so long. They've been given the term a monument.
Cool.
And they're, they have basically identical routes. Sometimes they get added to, but it's like a big thing get added to. But there was this year, one of the well-known ones is Paris-Roubaix. It's run on cobbles, so it's distinguishing features. It's just like a lot of huge cobbles, right, going on. And one this year, Canadian one, Alison Jackson for in the women's race, because women's cycling is super fun and super big. If people want to get into cycling, I'd actually recommend women's cycling. There's one. There's someone who's winning. Demi Vollering is winning all the time right now, but there's definitely been some good races. In this race, it was really exciting, and the Canadian pulled it out at the end, just because of this miscommunication and infighting between the breakaway. So Alison Jackson was in the breakaway, kind of what we were discussing. about this like kind of a break that forms off the main group, which is called the peloton. And then this chasing group that was kind of tracing from the peloton to the breakaway couldn't get they couldn't decide because they didn't want to put too much energy to help like chase up because then they wouldn't have enough for the sprint. And then it just like didn't work out, and the Canadian won. Not saying that she didn't 100% deserve it, but you know the main leader who you would have expected, which is kind of neat. So and then the Tour de France will happen after the Giro. It's the one that everyone knows, kind of gets the most money. It's where most of the marketing goes. But what I didn't realize when I got into it was just how many races were going on that wasn't the Tour de France. Like you come from this North American audience, which I'm trying to broaden here. And there's like the season goes on basically all year, except for the fall. The fall gets pretty quiet. But it's pretty enjoyable to be part of because you can just it's like all year.
Cool. So, and we're talking about teams. Are teams typically national teams? It'd be like the French team, the German team, or not necessarily?
Yeah, interesting. That's a good question. So teams you do have national teams.
Okay, yeah.
But there's different levels. So there's the World Tour, which is 20 teams or 18 teams. And there's World Tour races where only the World Tour teams have to go to.
Gotcha.
And there's 2 wild cards from the lower level, which is, it's kind of like soccer or like football. And then you have the pro level, which is below World Tour.
Gotcha. And
then you have the .1 and the .2.
Okay.
And .2 is basically anyone, but .1 is like continental kind of thing. And that's where the national teams will come in. So you do have your national teams, but mainly you have these teams that are funded by, you have an owner on the team, and then they get funded by partners. And so the team's names will change every year, which is quite confusing, depending on the sponsor. So you have Jumbo-Visma, which is a grocery store, Belgian grocery store. And then another well-known team is Ineos Grenadiers. Ineos is, can't remember the company, but it's a billionaire who owns it. That one's pretty stable. It used to be Sky, but then it transitioned to Ineos. And then, there's Trek Segafredo. So Trek is a bike company that you might know. Segafredo. It's usually these like combination of companies where they like mash together. And like the jerseys change every year because of that as well, which I find super annoying. But also super fun. I mean, like it's fun to see new designs every year. But it is, and I also used to not be a fan of like the jerseys themselves. I thought they were kind of like plastered with too many kind of ads, but they're growing on me. So, and to be fair, cyclists need all the money you can get, given the audience is so niche. The teams are 20. Sorry, it differs on the level, but the teams at the World Tour are 30 riders, and 6 to 8 riders will go to an event depending on what type of race it is. So if it has more hills, it makes squad.
Yeah, cool.
And if depending on the, like some riders go to classics, so they'll go to the classic races, which are 1 days. But there's some that are week long. And then these riders will also might be racing at the same time too. There might be 2 races going on at the same time, so they'll send different squads. And there's this whole kind of UCI, which is the kind of like global cycling body, where it's like a relegation battle. So you have this other battle, which is across the board, which is this points battle, which is kind of like, again, football in the UK, where you get relegated. You can get relegated here as well, but it's over a 3-year time span instead of a 1-year time span. It's triannual, which is a little bit different from what most people experience. And so you want to send riders to get these, right? So you're trying to maximize your points at the same time so that you stay ahead of all these.
So the points are awarded at the team level or at the rider level?
Points are awarded at the rider level, but they're also awarded sometimes at the team level because you'll have like a team classification to your friends. And to your point on teams and countries, what is interesting is some teams will try and only acquire riders from that country. So Uno X is a petrochemical company in Norway, I believe. Could be Denmark. Sorry, Danish people, if I got that one wrong. But they're really only going to take Danish riders. That's what they only want to do, and they've explicitly stated that. We'll take some other Scandinavian riders because, like, you know, there's only so many Norwegian riders out there. But there's also like French teams like Arkea who will want to fill up their squad, or Groupama FDJ will want to fill up the squad with French riders mainly.
Yeah.
And so they'll kind of do that. And then like there's other, what I find is like some teams, so the Astana Kazakhstan team is sponsored, those two teams sponsored by like states, like countries. So there's UAE and Astana Kazakhstan. And Astana has some Kazakh riders, but it's also really heavily Italian based. So it's just like and this is just like nuance. Like you just like kind of like, they don't explicitly say, oh, we just like do Italian riders, but really they just do Italian riders. And so, and like EF Education Post, which had Allison Jackson, who won that race, is like tries to hire US based. Israel Premier Tech tries to hire Canadians. I haven't dug into exactly why. I'm sure it's some sort of the founder is Canadian or the company is Canadian or something like that, right? And so you have all these little kind of nuances, what's going on. But within the team, the interesting part about the team is it's usually only one or two leaders, right? So you have these 6 to 8 riders, but there's really only one or two general classification riders who the team is actually trying for.
Gotcha.
And so you have all these other riders who are helping that rider win, either by like, blocking the wind or like kind of doing that. But they're also sometimes allowed to go for a stage win if it's not going to affect the rider. If the rider doesn't need support, then they can go for the stage win. And then they'll probably take 1 or 2 sprints, because sprinters are really, sometimes it's a sprint on stage. You just, you see it and you look at the stage and you're like, well, that's going to be a sprint, right? Because there's no opportunity for like a break to form, which is usually over a hill or a climb. And then it just all comes down to a sprint. And so those stages are kind of boring. It's like a transition stage. You just like riders like bike 180 kilometers and then it just comes. Right? And so, and the main GC guys don't go for the sprint because it's too risky. You could crash and then get injured, or you lose your spot. So it's kind of funny in that way. But it's a slow build. The whole sport is a slow build. It's really fun to watch. And the unexpected happens all the time. Some rider does a really good job that you don't expect to happen. And so it's also why you'll get in sports betting, you'll get these gigantic odds. So we did really well with Derek G recently, who's a Canadian, who's recently won 2 stages from the Giro.
Okay.
He had 601 odds. Wow. So when we put down $1, we would get $601 back. We did an each way bet. So it was on an each way bet, it kind of differs, but the odds were, if your rider comes first, you get $601. If your rider comes second or third, you get 1/4 of whatever the odds were. Okay. So $125. Which is still, it was a good payday, like don't get us wrong, but it's why you have these crazy, you see, compared to other sports betting numbers, you'll have Toronto Blue Jays have 2.5 to win or 1.75 to win, not 601, right? 601 is insane. But that's just what happens, right? Because first you got to bet on they get in the breakaway, which is 4 to 7 riders out of 180. And then they have to have a good enough sprint to come top 3 out of those riders. So we find that the sports betting is also a fun part of it, just because it kind of like, there's so many nuances you can play with, and it kind of feeds in there. So the more research you do, it actually does have some impact on how well you can do, which is quite entertaining. And also I would recommend people who are getting into it for time trial stages. We think it's really fun, because most people find time trial stages quite boring, which is fair. But we really enjoy it, because if you space it right, sometimes like you get riders who you bet on who are going off at certain points of time throughout the entire race. So it's kind of fun to like
keeps you engaged
the entire time. But then also we find you can do the most research and do the best with the time trial stages, because there's less variables. Cycling has way too many goals. And when it comes to time trialing, you can kind of reduce that number and have a better shot of actually doing pretty well. So cool.
You mentioned bets on like finishing first, finishing second. Are there other like categories of bets that are common? Like, can you bet on teams? Can you bet on specific
100%
stages?
Yeah, great question. So it differs per event. So if you have one of the general, the Grand Tours, they'll do a lot more, because they know the liquidity in that market. People are going to be betting, so they have a lot more options. You can like bet on top 10, top 5, points classification, which is like who gets the most points, who's going to win King of the Mountains, who there's points for getting to the top of a hill, right, on every stage. There's rider to win 3+ stages, rider to win 2+ stages, all those, right? But that doesn't usually happen other than the Grand Tour. The main ones are, for the other ones are, each way bets. So like you bet on the first place and you have to do a second bet to be able to bet for second or third. Kind of like it forces you. And then there's head-to-head. So it pits off two riders who are similar caliber together and then gives you odds, which is more similar to betting on teams in the NHL or NFL kind of thing. And then you can usually parlay those. And the nice thing about that is there's less luck involved. I think generally when you parlay those, so we've had pretty good success, compared to doing parlay on 4 MLB games, Major League Baseball games. You can do a parlay on roughly the same odds. You'll have like 2.25 kind of thing. And you can do 3 or 4 of those riders together to create an odds of like 16, usually is what we aim for, and still have pretty good success. If you like do some research, you think about who's going to be going for general classification, like what is their team. It's not too tricky. Like you spend 20 minutes at the end of the day, you pick some of these parlays, you'll do pretty well.
For the novice sports bettors out there like me, what's parlaying? And
so it's differing. Talking to certain friends in the industry, and so in the Europe it's called doubling, I think.
Okay.
But parlaying is just combining multiple bets together. So if one fails, they all fail. Okay. So but they multiply each other. So if you have 2.25, you can do singles, and you can do 2.25. Put down $1, you get 2.25, right?
Yep.
And you can do that for all of them, or you can say, hey, I'll take $16 back, so 2 times 2 times 2 times 2.
Yeah.
Only if all of them are successful. So if all 4 of those riders beat the other 4 riders, take the $16, otherwise I lose. Even if 3 of the 4 are successful, I lose. All right, so it's a riskier option, and usually it's like, I would say most other sports, it is a lottery. You're picking lottery picks. But I think in cycling, it's different. I think that's what's really nuanced about cycling is it's just different. The variables in play can be researched really well, and maybe it just makes sense to me. Maybe I'm just doing well, but I've quintupled my bankroll since I've started. Nice. So I think anybody who wants to spend some time getting into a sport that's enjoyable on so many aspects and so many levels, I think cycling is really good. I don't think it's for everyone. I think, some of my friends have said like, I don't have the attention span. I would say you can increase your attention span by, reading long form articles or spending time. And I'm not going to beat everyone over the head with a stick and say, you got to watch cycling, but I enjoy it.
Speaking of watching cycling, let's say I tune in tomorrow morning, I open up Giro. What am I thinking about? What am I looking at? Like, what am I, you know what I mean? Help explain to me what different strategies are, or like what I'd be looking for when I'm watching.
Yeah, so you kind of want to pay attention at the start of a race, and that's when the break usually breaks form, generally. Sometimes they don't. Again, sometimes it's a sprint stage, and like all the riders just go boringly for 180 kilometers. But usually you want to pay attention to the start, because it'll be interesting, like, they'll be debating who to allow in the break, depending on how long their time gap is from the GC contenders. So if you're 15 minutes off of first place, you'll probably be allowed in the break. But they'll only allow that break to go out to 14 minutes, right? And they'll be on the radio with the team cars, and the team cars will have like the TV playing and whatever, and like they'll know everything. They'll have Velo Viewer, which is like kind of like a 3 map kind of. And they'll just know, okay, we're only going to allow the break have 10 minutes. But that initial kind of stage that is like, who's going to get in the break, right? And like, they're kind of fighting with each other, and they're like, kind of like, they attack, and which just means they go faster. And then a few of them will get into the break, or they might not get into the break and get reeled back. And so that's what you're kind of watching for. And then you have this period where it could be just constant fighting the entire day, but usually it's not. Usually the break forms. And then for a good 80 kilometers or so, it's usually like an hour and a half. It's usually pretty boring. You can go have lunch, whatever. It's not always like that, though. There's certain stages. So on our website, we point out certain key stages where general classification battles will happen, and that's where action is all the time.
Cool.
You'll be going up a mountain. There might be
Yeah.
attack on the mountain. They might be caught back up, and then on the next mountain they'll be caught back up. And so it's kind of like you have all these opportunities, and those are the days you really want to watch. And so we'll point those out on our posts. And then on the other days, though, again the break forms, and then it might be reeled back right at the end. Like they're so good at just like reeling these guys back right at the end. It might be a bunch sprint at the end. So you might have this break form and go for the 100, 200 kilometers. And then they'll just, the peloton is just so much faster because they have so many more bodies that they can circle through and the aerodynamics, and they'll just bring them back. And then there'll be a bunch sprint at the end. So the break isn't necessarily, it sucks for the break sometimes. Like recently, a few days ago, these two riders just went for 180 Ks, and in the last 500 meters, they got reeled in by the break. And imagine the riders, it would have been so much harder for the two of them to ride 180 compared to the peloton, where it's just with the aerodynamics and everything, so much easier. So that's what you're kind of looking for. And so you're watching these key riders. I guess, digging in, you'd want to probably ask someone. They do a good job, the announcers, but like, who are the main contenders? You know, you have to have some backstory, right? Without the backstory, it's pretty hard to enjoy it, I would say. And so I would recommend, it's a good comment because maybe we can do something on our site to kind of illustrate this to people, but like, how do I start watching the Giro, right? And so it's like, these are the main contenders. Here's a photo of them. Here's what they look like on a bike. And then you can kind of see what's actually happening and pay attention. But again, it's one of those sports where it's not enjoyable right off the bat, but it's like those things in life where you spend a little bit of energy, a little bit of effort, and it becomes drastically more rewarding compared to some other thing where you can pick up very quickly. And so, I would recommend just like learning the top riders in the GC, and that will get you a long way to actually enjoying the race a little bit better. And one of the great things about cycling is, you know, when it's offered through GCN, it's like pretty cheap. It's like $80 the entire year. And the announcers are quite entertaining. They realize cycling isn't the most, you know, action-packed race the entire time. So they're bantering with each other. They're, you know, making jokes, and they'll explain some tactics along the way too. So watching it with some of that audio is
nice. And as a spectator, do you find that like in a 3-week tour, the first couple days are more exciting than the last couple days, or like, you know, there's like specific days of be a mountain or specific exciting days, or how do you find like throughout the tour your involvement in?
Yeah, the tours are usually backloaded, which means they have the hardest stages at the end with the most climbing. Climbing usually doesn't start to the middle of the Grand Tour.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's weird. But essentially, I think maybe it's because they want to allow the sprinters at the start to have a chance. A lot of the sprinters actually just drop out of the tour after like once the hills start coming, because they're just like, oh, fuck, I can't do this. And so. But it also allows a switch over of the jersey. So every Grand Tour has like a leader who wears a specific colored jersey. And so it's very prestigious. And so it allows that jersey to switch over between the people in the first few days. Before the GC battle is kind of like settled, people and like one person wears the jersey every day kind of thing. It allows that jersey to circulate, which is a bit more fun, a little bit more entertaining. So it kind of like stack that in a bit with the sprinters. You know, jerseys switching around, GC battle starts to heat up in the second week kind of thing. And then like whoever can survive and like kind of finish strong in the final. And so that's usually.
And for some of these racers, how many races they do in a year?
So you're usually looking at around 60 race days every year, which is a lot. Some do less, some do more. I think the most is probably around 80 race days, but you still got to time it well. Like, the era of everyone complains these days, not complains, but they just say the modern cycling, you have to be, every race is hard now. There used to be some easy races where you could show up and not be on your top game, but now every race is hard. So they have to like do periodization in their training to make sure they're like peaking at the right times with the performance. So they do the altitude camps at the right times. So they'll go to altitude for like 2 weeks right before the tour, and then they'll come down. And so everything is like really really, like, you got, it's no, it's not like the old days apparently. But like, you weigh your food, you do these altitude camps, like, you have to be super aerodynamic all the time. And so that's what also, like, some of the younger generation of riders is super proficient at being, knowing, like, aerodynamics is becoming a bigger and bigger issue these days, and these younger riders really care about it, compared to some of the older riders. And you can, in the time trials, you can clearly see it. It's very, very obvious that these younger riders are outperforming the older riders. There's this thing called CDA, which is a coefficient of drag, and it's younger riders just know what to do. There's this outstanding star, Ben Healy, who's shown up this year, a breakout star this year, who's in the classics. He would wear a skin suit, just like a one-piece suit compared to like the bib and the top. And he does that because it's like much more aerodynamic. And some of probably why he's done so well. I mean, he's an amazing rider, but I'm sure some of it is because of the skin suit he wears. So, tech, and that affects the teams too, right? Because some teams don't have as much budget. There's no budget cap compared to some of the other sports. So if you can spend a ton of money on your budget setup, you'll do really well. Yeah. So like Derek G, who we made a lot of money on, thank you, Derek. He's on Israel Premier Tech, and he's the national time trial champion of Canada. But Israel Premier Tech doesn't have a lot of money. And so he doesn't do very well in time trials, even though he should, in theory, because their time trial is just like shit compared to Ineos or one of the other big name teams who has a lot of backing and money. I mean, those were good questions.
One more kind of high level question. You talked about like 60, maybe 60 to 80 days of racing per rider. We have like 30-ish riders on a team, kind of like changing races every year. How like orchestrated and planned out is the whole year by the admins of the team? Like, does everyone kind of know which races they're going to be in and can train like 3 months from now, I'm going to be in this race, so I need to go in this altitude, you know what I mean? Or is it kind of more ad hoc as it goes?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the tours will release their roadmap or the road books in the fall of the previous year. Yeah. And so the teams will view the road books and decide if it suits the rider. So if it has a lot of hills, if it has a lot of time trials. And so those main GC riders, there's only a select few GC riders who can actually ride at the correct caliber to be a general classification rider. And so they'll decide if they want to go to the Tour or the Giro or La Vuelta. And so what usually happens with La Vuelta is someone who doesn't do well in the Giro, like maybe Remco will do this because he got sick. He was the one who was leading, and then he got COVID 2 days ago. He'll probably go to the Vuelta. So the Vuelta is like a backup option. So if you don't do well or something goes wrong in your preparation for the Tour, you crash, you get in an accident, like this happens all the time, they'll go to the Vuelta because it's in August and it's like a backup kind of 3-week race. But otherwise, it depends on the team. They usually plan it out. For the riders have some say or less say, depending on how good they are. Pogačar is very well-known riders, wins basically everything, and he has a lot of say now in what he wants to do and where he wants to go to. But say you're a domestique or someone who works for the general classification rider, you'll have less say what races you go to. But again, it's a kind of nuanced back and forth, and also depends on like the caliber. And
cool.
All right, so I think we'll wrap up here. We had a good chat. I'm personally getting tired, but we really appreciate Nick coming on. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to send us on our socials, like, subscribe, obviously all that jazz. Hopefully we improve from here, but if you're even at all interested in cycling, we recommend you take a stab because it's pretty damn cool. Nick might even watch it, but we're not sure. We'll see. We'll give you an update later. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. This has been Brent from Pro Cycling Bets, and we look forward to you listening to the next one. We'd graciously appreciate you leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or whichever podcast player you're listening from, signing up to our newsletter at procyclingbets.com, or following us on social media, specifically subscribing to Pro Cycling Bets on YouTube. All the links are in the show notes. Ciao.